Today's very brief program before we have lunch is discussing the Muslim community's relationship with law enforcement, and particularly with the Federal Bureau of Investigations. We have a very special guest, Mr. Mike German with the ACLU, the former FBI agent, who will be speaking with us and also discussing a report that the ACLU put out not long ago in terms of documenting FBI abuses with the American public. And I will just be, before he comes up, sharing a few pieces of information with you all, as well as reminding those of us in the room who are not attorneys or civil rights advocates about one particular important piece of information regarding your rights. Before I get to that part, I placed on the table, on your tables, this report that CAIR released less than 2 weeks ago called Legislating Fear, Islamophobia and its Impact in the United States. And to this date, this is the most thorough report that we have to date that is tracking both the inner core and outer core of the Islamophobia network in the United States of America, showing the main players, individuals in here who in fact help shape public policy, who some congressmen work directly with, some individuals in this book who have given Islamophobic training to United States military officers, to Federal Bureau of Investigation officers, and as well have been involved in working with state representatives in trying to spread so-called anti-Sharia legislation, such as the legislation that was put forward here in the state of Michigan but failed by former State Representative Dave Ejima. So this report goes through this very thoroughly. I left a couple of copies online. I mean on your table, but the entire copy is online. If you go to this report, and you can take a look at this map very briefly. Here shows the inner core of the Islamophobia network here in the United States of America, in which some of this inner core is actually based in the state of Michigan. And if you look at the amount from 2008 until 2011, the amount of money is staggering in terms of people whose primary job is used to foment Islamophobia in the American society. In particular, these people are involved in lobbying. Almost $120 million have been spent just on this within the inner core, not including the outer core, which part of their job is to foment Islamophobia, but not their primary responsibility. And one of those, which is in the inner core, is the American Freedom Law Center, and its director was part of the Thomas More Law Center that is based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that is part of the outer core of fomenting Islamophobia and involved in legal actions that are based upon anti-Muslim principles. Just a brief, now as I segue, I'm sure all of you in this room understand the tension that the American Muslim community has had with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and in particular in the state of Michigan. It takes place across the country, but particularly we have tension in the state of Michigan. I want to take you back almost 4 years ago, on October 28th, 4 years ago, right here in Dearborn, Michigan. There was a colleague of mine by the name of Luqman Amin Abdullah, who was shot, fatally shot, 21 times by the Federal Bureau of Investigations. And we actually have a wrongful death lawsuit we are suing the FBI right now in court, including the former special agent in charge, Andrew Arena. Actually, I found from Mike, he was in training school with this individual. But the scenario that led up to him being killed is extremely problematic, and I know that Mike will go into some of this relating to the informants issues, but there were no less than 3 confidential informants, according to the criminal affidavit, that were sent into his mosque, and at least one of them was actively working as an agent provocateur, in which Lukman was led to that warehouse that day in a setup in which a dog was then let loose on him after he laid down on the ground on his stomach. And then he was shot 21 times, including once in the back. Now, this wrongful death lawsuit that we have, and we're also suing, we are alleging fraud, that the FBI was actually involved in fraud, in a cover-up, and that public statements were made that in fact were fallacious. It is our contention that Imam Lukman never even had a gun. They claim that he shot the dog, when in fact there's no forensic evidence or any proof that he had a gun whatsoever, and we have an eyewitness who has a sworn affidavit that said he had no gun. I'm not sure how many of you know that, but this is part of what's going to be coming up in court. But also, besides these 3 confidential informants, we also have learned that there were also 2 Muslims who are community leaders who also were involved in having discussions with the Federal Bureau of Investigations regarding this one particular imam. And that's because they themselves were approached and questioned, and they themselves perhaps felt pressured to say certain things. So there's 3 people who are outside. One of them we know for sure who was posing to be a Muslim who wasn't a Muslim. But then we also had the issue of 2 people who are in fact community leaders. And when this is exposed in court, this is going to be a very troubling issue in the community, when these 2 individuals will end up being exposed if we get past the motion to dismiss. Now, it is our advice, and I'm giving this to you for informational purposes. I'm not giving you legal advice right here. This is for informational purposes. I have to make that disclaimer, especially since this is being video recorded. You have the right that if the police, local, state, federal law enforcement comes to you at your home, your job, and they ask you questions, you have the right to speak with them through your attorney. Either having your attorney present or not even talking with them directly, but having questions posed to your attorney, and then your attorney then has the discussion back and forth with them. We strongly suggest that as community members in the Muslim community, that if the Federal Bureau of Investigations comes and pays you a visit, that you exercise this right and speak to them if you want to even speak to them. It is through your attorney. At CAIR Michigan, we have our staff attorney, Lena Musri. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here this morning because she's battling, she's been trying to go with the flu. But she has dealt over the years with over dozens, hundreds of these types of situations where people have been approached in the community by the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and then she has then had discussions or correspondence. In 90% of the cases, when we contact the FBI and ask regarding what do you want to speak with Fulan bin Fulan about, or so-and-so, what do you want to speak with them about, the FBI does not come back to ask any further questions. 90% of the time. Which leads us to believe that they're going through fishing expeditions. Also, let it be known, or you should know, that anytime there is a tense situation that goes on in the Muslim world, or if there's some chatter about a particular region of the Muslim world in Congress, shortly after that, the FBI then goes and begins to question people within that particular ethnic demographic shortly after. And as a matter of fact, I think it was like a little over a month ago, about a month and a half ago, I was at a meeting at Columbia University with Mike and a number of other activists around national security, and we all saw this trend. If something happens, and let's say, I'll give you a contemporary example of what took place in Kenya with the Shabab and that attack that took place in the mall, and there were some Americans who were in that mall and that were held hostage at that mall. You best believe that after something like that happens, you know that then the FBI is going to be going into the Somali community, going to all Somalis, asking them how do they feel about a Shabab, do they have any family members in the Shabab. When the revolution started in Yemen to get rid of Ali Abdullah Saleh, he started going into the Yemeni community, started knocking on people's doors, asking them, how do you feel about President Saleh? How do you feel about the Houthiyyin, etc. We've seen this. Similarly, in the Syrian community, this is taking place. I just gave a training for a Know Your Rights presentation the past Sunday at a mosque in Detroit that's predominantly Nigerian. Why did I do this? Because there was a congressional report that came out not long ago claiming that Boko Haram, an extremist group in Nigeria, has the goal of trying to reach out to American Muslims. So as we're against what Boko Haram and Shabab does, we have to tell people about their constitutional rights so that they can be protected. Now, in conclusion, before I call up Mike, I want to be very clear that the Council on American Islamic Relations is pro-law enforcement. We are pro-law enforcement. We are just anti-law enforcement abuse. That's all. We are for the Federal Bureau of Investigations to do constitutional police work and investigation. Same thing goes for the Detroit Police Department. When I said the same thing to Chief Craig regarding this stop and frisk, where we have no problem with constitutional stop and frisk. We're against racial and ethnic and religious profiling. We had an issue of 2 teenagers who were stopped and frisked outside of a mosque in Detroit by the Detroit Police Department. So, so we have no problem with constitutional police work. We are against the invasive measures that are taking place against the Muslim community, in which we are being wholesale spied upon, and that community members, in a sense, are feeling pressured, almost feeling blackmailed, to act as informants against their own community, which then has a chilling effect of then some people are even scared to go to the mosque and to donate to certain charities like Mubarak or other charities that come into the Muslim community out of fear that someone is looking at them raising their hand or giving a donation if their name is called out, which then will then trigger the Federal Bureau of Investigations coming to give an interview under a so-called initial threat assessment. So this actually had a chilling effect in terms of even how we're able to display and practice our religion. But I want to be very clear about that, because some people think that we at CAIR are against law enforcement, and we absolutely are not against law enforcement. And I still, to this day, I've given, within the past year, sensitivity trainings to law enforcement, including immigration customs enforcement. I gave a training a few months back to the ICE officers, and perhaps that's a whole other discussion about what ICE does. But with that, I would like to call up Mr. German with the ACLU to speak with us briefly. Well, not briefly, you can please take your time and go through your information thoroughly. Then after that, we will avail ourselves for any questions and or comments.
Hi everyone, good morning, and thank you very much, Duwood. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you and talk about the work that we've been doing regarding resigning from the FBI and ultimately coming to work at the ACLU, sometimes I hear reporters or others suggest, oh, you switched sides. Where actually I think a lot of what I do is exactly the same. You know, in the FBI, I enforced the law and held individuals to account for the law when they broke it. And today, I'm still enforcing the law, holding the government to the law when they break it. And that's really the same. We expect what law enforcement expects from the public, we should expect from government. And particularly because the way the government talks about their authorities now, and one of the issues that I'm working on is the leaks of the activities that the intelligence community has been involved in spying on all Americans. They seem to suggest that they have the right to gather information so long as the law doesn't specifically prohibit it. But it's trying to explain to them that no, people have rights. The government has responsibilities, and one of their responsibilities, and the responsibility that I took an oath to protect when I joined the FBI, is to protect and defend the Constitution and the rights of all Americans. So that's where I come to this work. I'll give you a little background. I joined the FBI in 1988 after graduating from Northwestern Law School. I had decided to go to law school and join the FBI after considerable deliberation when I was 5, and told my parents that I was going to go to law school and join the FBI, and never considered anything else. But coming up that way was interesting because I was just fascinated with the FBI and wanted to learn everything I could about the FBI, and read about the bad old days under J. Edgar Hoover, and felt very lucky that I was joining the FBI during a period where they had learned those lessons and had put in proper guidelines that would protect Americans' rights, as the FBI is responsible for doing. And for the most part of my career, I felt that was effective, that the FBI did play within the rules. Like any government agency, like any entity, not necessarily the most efficient organization or the most effective. And one of the problems with agencies that have intelligence powers or any sort of secret authorities is that abuse can occur, and it's hard for the public to discover that. But for the most part, for the first 14 years, I felt that what I was doing at the FBI was very positive. But then 9/11 happened, and I saw changes to the FBI's rules that I knew would be problematic for the ability to protect Americans' rights, and tried to make change from within, but found that was not appreciated, and decided that it was time for me to leave the FBI and to find another way to do this work, and was fortunate enough to get picked up by the ACLU. And have been involved in a lot of different kinds of work. I work for Washington Legislative Office, which does the ACLU's national organizations lobbying on federal policy and federal legislation. But I'm a registered lobbyist, but I serve as a policy counsel, which means that I serve basically to try to get ahead of issues. So much of lobbying is difficult because there's intense amount of activity that's happening all the time. Bills are being introduced every day that somebody has to analyze, going up to meetings on the Hill, that it's often difficult for us to get ahead of issues. So they created this policy counsel position so that we could try to put out reports ahead of policy so that when issues come up, there's some basis for legislators to reach out to the ACLU and other civil rights organizations to identify the problems that they have to correct. So over the last 2 years, we've spent a considerable amount of time working with the ACLU's national office, their litigation department in New York, and affiliates across the country, including here in Michigan, gathering information about FBI activities, particularly a program they started in 2009 under a policy change that was made in 2008. The FBI is governed by what are called the Attorney General Guidelines. Back in the J. Edgar Hoover days, when those abuses were uncovered, it was discovered that, or realized that the FBI was operating without a rule book, that Congress had never given them limitations in law, and so they saw that as an opportunity to do whatever they wanted until they got caught. So when they finally did get caught in the late 70s, the Attorney General issued guidelines. Attorney General Levy basically made a rule book for the FBI, and basically the rule book was designed to make them focus on investigations of suspected criminal activity. And those were the rules that I operated on. They changed. Each Attorney General sort of put a new spin on them, but they changed slightly over time until 9/11, when they changed significantly in 2002 under Attorney General John Ashcroft, and then more significantly in December of 2008. Literally a month before the Bush administration walked out the door, they completely changed the rules for the FBI, taking away any need for what is called a factual predicate before the FBI can start investigations. So when I worked in the FBI, working criminal matters, I needed to have a reasonable basis, factual basis for starting a case. So I had to look at the people I was investigating and say, okay, I have these reasons to believe this person is committing this federal crime. And what I used to tell young agents who I would train, if you can't sit down with a piece of paper and say what crime you think this person is committing and why you think that, there's probably somebody worse out there that you should spend your time with. Because if you can't even come up with a reason why you would investigate this person, you shouldn't. Unfortunately, they took that need for a factual predicate away. So the FBI agents today can go out and investigate whoever they want. So what that has done is created an opportunity to conduct investigations of completely innocent people to gather information about them. And that includes targeting entire communities. One of the most disconcerting policies that was created under this new policy was called the Racial and Ethnic Mapping Program. And usually the FBI is good about putting, sort of nice-sounding names on things, but this is as bad as it sounds. They're going around the country in neighborhoods across America, gathering demographic information from the U.S. Census to identify what they call clusters of racial concentration and ethnic concentration, with the idea that once they have identified these neighborhoods, they would target them for more intense investigative or intelligence collection, which is, of course, antithetical to American values of equality. And again, the FBI doesn't have rights. It has responsibilities, and it has responsibilities to all of those communities, no matter what their ethnic concentrations are. The government is here to serve you. That's the system we set up in the United States, not us to serve it. We did a nationwide FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request to try to get some of this data and to be able to look at these maps to see how the FBI was using them. And what we got confirmed our worst fears. The FBI basically creates a justification for what it's doing based on crass racial stereotypes. We have a memo from the San Francisco FBI that says Chinese people in San Francisco have been involved in organized crime for decades, so that justifies identifying where all the Chinese people in San Francisco live. We have a memo from Alabama where they say MS-13 is a criminal gang that is predominantly made up of Latinos, so that gives us the right to identify where all people of Latino descent live in Alabama. The same in New Jersey. In Georgia, we have a memo that purports that there is a threat of black separatism, and it uses that purported threat to justify tracking the growth of the black population in Georgia. So it's really troubling documents, not just in the stereotyping, but in the purpose for them. The purpose for the FBI doesn't exist to make pretty maps of how America looks, right? It's an intelligence and law enforcement organization, and the reason it's identifying these communities based entirely on their race is to target them. And even the FBI, in responding to our criticism when we got these documents, said, this is no different than a chief of police in some small town putting push pins on the map where crimes have occurred to learn how to distribute his forces. Except that there is a key difference. the FBI isn't mapping criminals, they're mapping people based entirely on their race, no matter their innocence. Part of that is discussed in the report. The other part that we sought information of, and of course here in Michigan, we have a Detroit FBI memo that makes the statement that there are 100 and something terrorist organizations in the Middle East, so they use that to justify mapping Middle Eastern populations here in Michigan. Those documents are online. We put them up so you can see them. They're also referenced in our report. I put a copy of the executive summary on your table, and it has the URL that you can go to read the full report. The full report's about 60 pages, so my luggage would have been too heavy for me to get here if I printed out all the copies. So hopefully you can go online and find that. But read the executive summary, and it'll give you an idea of where the report goes. The other program, which is also a program that's not based on reasonable factual basis of suspicion, is something that they call eGuardian. And this is a suspicious activity reporting program where the public and police departments across the country are encouraged to report activities they think are suspicious to this FBI database that then can be accessed by other law enforcement officers across the country, which in and of itself doesn't sound so bad, except these programs also tell people what is suspicious. And what they consider suspicious includes things like taking notes, which I see you doing there, drawing diagrams, taking measurements, taking photographs, taking videotapes. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to report you as well. With these things, of course, are not suspicious at all. So what it does is create the opportunity for police and members of the public to see people doing what is entirely innocuous, but report that based on their suspicion of the person because of the way they look and their own internal bias. So we did FOIAs across the country to get information about the program, and just 2 weeks ago released documents that we got from California, where we do see, it's a person photographing a bridge, but the reason they're suspicious is because it's a person who has a Middle Eastern appearance who's photographing the bridge. There's a tremendous, for some reason they focus on photographers, so be careful when you're using your camera out there. It's really, from my perspective, having done counterterrorism work, it's astonishing to me that they would want such a program that, number one, is going to be so biased in the selection of what's reported to it that you're going to create a huge database of biased information. But then one of the other elements that we got from this nationwide FOIA was the FBI training materials. And I'm sure you saw some of the reporting on that. These incredibly factually flawed training materials the FBI has been using. And we have documents from this Freedom of Information Act request going from 2003 to 2011. So this is, almost 10 years of training with these materials. It maybe explains why the FBI agents you sometimes deal with have such poor understanding of these communities, is because they have been receiving this really despicable training. To the government's credit, they have gone in, and the FBI specifically went in to do a review of their training materials. They say that they have removed 800 pages of materials that they won't be using anymore. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of transparency in how they've done that review or what materials they've reviewed. One of the most problematic documents that we have is a 2006 training program, or actually it's an intelligence product, which is why we're a bit concerned that it's not part of this review. It purports to explain how people become terrorists, the so-called radicalization process. And it's problematic, again, from my view as a former law enforcement agent, because it's not based on any factual studies. In fact, factual studies show there is no profile of a terrorist. There is no pattern that can be used to predict the next terrorist. And in fact, it's a very rare thing that happens and therefore very difficult to predict. But the FBI's theory, which has been adopted by the New York Police Department, which justifies their surveillance of the Muslim community programs, suggests that people start from being normal people of a particular community and then start to get dangerous ideas. And these can be political ideas. And then they start associating with people these documents. NYPD has a similar radicalization process document that is based very directly off the FBI material. And it suggests things like going to mosques or coffee shops or community centers or universities or prisons. It pretty much names every place you could possibly go in a community, whether from a prison to a university, are what they call nodes of radicalization. And what they consider to be indicators of potential dangerousness include things like adopting religious clothes, wearing religious garb, praying more often or less often is an indicator. I mean, it's really quite troubling that they would use these clearly First Amendment protected activities as indicators of dangerousness, not just because there's no factual basis to support it, but that it teaches these agents to focus on these behaviors. One of them is growing a beard, but if you read the whole document carefully, the two of them together, shaving your beard is also dangerous. So, you really can't win. It's, again, just sort of this system that is set up to suggest that all people in a community are suspicious just based on their religion or racial and ethnic background. So what we've done with our report, excuse me, is document how the FBI's rules have changed, and then how these problematic programs are allowed to occur because of the loose rules that the FBI currently operates under. So it's very detailed. It goes back all the way to 9/11 to show how the changes over time led to this increasingly problematic behavior by the FBI. One of the areas that Dawood asked me to focus on is the area of FBI informants. And of course, it's nothing new for the FBI to have informants. Law enforcement depends heavily on informants. And they can be used in ways that are entirely lawful and necessary, but also can be abused. And what we've seen lately, particularly in Muslim communities, is an excessive use of informants, but also an excessive effort to recruit informants to go into religious communities where there is no crime suspected, and that is entirely problematic. And then, of course, the worst part of it, where we actually see informants acting as agents provocateur, not just collecting information, but actually instigating criminal activity so that people can be arrested. And part of what is driving that is this radicalization theory, because the government, based on this radicalization theory, they sometimes call it a funnel, so that if you're in this funnel, you're the community that the terrorists come out of. So it's very hard to find the very few terrorists that exist, so it's very easy to find the community, right? So they then target the community and then use these informants, many of whom have criminal records, many of whom actually have fraud convictions, so they're good at tricking people into doing things, to go into the community to find people who are vulnerable and coax them into committing criminal acts or going down the road to commit criminal acts. And oftentimes, what's very different from my work in the FBI is where the entirety of the criminal conduct is brought to the subject, right? So it's the plot is the idea of the informant. The explosives or weapons used are entirely produced by the government, where somebody literally is sitting there never having obtained a weapon on their own and is yet handed weapons by the government and then arrested for possessing those weapons. It's really kind of shocking, but unfortunately the courts have been very reluctant to find this activity entrapment or otherwise government misconduct, which is problematic because it's damaging not just cases that affect the Muslim community, but damaging the criminal justice system entirely. If the government is in a position where it can go out and instigate crime, they can do that to anyone. And if this is allowed in this community, it eventually will touch every community, which is why it's so important to try to stop it now. We had a case in Newburgh, New York, where an informant who had a criminal background went into a community and found some people who were desperate and offered the person $250,000 at one point to commit a crime, a terrorist crime, and provided all the weaponry to solve that crime. And the judge, once it went to a jury and the individual was found guilty, said only the government could have created a terrorist out of this individual. His buffoonery was Shakespearean, which sounds like something the judge would say right before she would throw out the verdict and say that this was entrapment, but instead she sentenced him to 25 years in jail. And that case has just survived an appeal. So it's really troubling that the FBI has changed in the way it has. So what we're hoping is with a new change in leadership at the FBI, they just got a new director, James Comey, former Justice Department official under George Bush, and John Ashcroft, is now the director of the FBI, and we're hoping that the change in leadership will give the President, the Attorney General, Congress, and the new director an opportunity to look at the way these FBI powers have changed to narrow them and to prevent this abuse. So we have a number of letters going up trying to get these abuses taken care of. And one of the other abuses, which is why I'm happy to come out here and support Dawood, is that this public policy of disparaging care and ostracizing care from community events. And there's no justification that can explain why a law enforcement agency can make public remarks disparaging a civil rights organization and obviously impeding its work or attempting to impede its work without giving that organization an opportunity to see charges against it so that it can defend itself. It's just clearly violative of their First Amendment rights and the Fifth Amendment. So we're writing a letter to the Inspector General asking for an investigation of this policy that will be released on Monday. Part of the reason why I feel so strongly about that issue is we all remember those hearings in Congress that explored this radicalization idea. Actually, the first ones were in 1917 and 1918. It's called the Overman Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee. They investigated what was then a terrorist threat from anarchists in the United States that were actually doing quite a number of bombings. But rather than investigating the bombings, they were investigating the ideas that were radical at the time, which included labor rights, it included civil rights, it included First Amendment rights for conscientious objectors in the military. And they targeted this group of lawyers that called themselves the National Civil Liberties Board, who were defending people who were being charged under these draconian laws. And that, of course, was the precursor organization of the ACLU. So we've been through this before, and we know that the targeting of civil rights organizations is a dangerous thing for the government, particularly for the FBI to be doing. The FBI was involved and actually searched the National Civil Liberties Bureau's offices, trying to get information about their support for conscientious objectors and other anti-war protesters during World War I. So, I think it's time for us to make sure that we are keeping an eye on these agencies. We have this great gift that Edward Snowden has given us that has really opened up the eyes, not just of the public, but actual members of Congress who have approved of these surveillance authorities that were being read in such an overbroad way by the government to allow them to spy on all Americans So we've finally seen the members of Congress have really mobilized. We have 25 bills going through Congress right now to address those authorities and to add more transparency to the process. So we're very hopeful that this is an opportunity to start looking at these surveillance programs writ large, because of course the problem with these secret programs is because of what we know now, we might be able to shut down a program or two publicly that have publicly become known, but if two more sprout up that we don't know about in secret, we haven't really solved the problem. So we're hoping for Congress to take a comprehensive look at the FBI, the National Security Agency, and all these different agencies, so that we can start getting control of these agencies to make sure that they are serving the public and not violating our rights. So I'm happy to take any questions and